California and the Western U.S., 1860 to 1865. Homesteading is when a person occupies a public land for 5 years and develops the land, then they can get ownership of the land. In 1860, the Congress passed the Homestead Act of 1860. This law, like others before it, were meant to help settlers find a permanent home and to develop the territories in the West. The Homestead Act of 1860 would have granted land to settlers in the western U.S. If you remember, Spain had a very difficult time getting more people to move up to the territory in the early 1800s. And the Homestead Act was a way to motivate people to move to the West because they would get land ownership. The federal government wanted to settle the large territory in the West. There was a huge problem. The North and South were fighting over the question of slavery. The South was pro-slavery and the North were free soilers, meaning soil that would be free and would not allow slavery. In 1856, James Buchanan was elected president, and he was a Democrat. At the time, the Democrats were pro-slavery. The South was worried that the Homestead Act of 1860 gave land to settlers who would choose to have a free state, and they wanted the land for slave statehood. President Buchanan vetoed the Homestead Act of 1860. To veto means that the President of the United States can refuse to sign a bill into law, and therefore it never becomes law. The Pony Express was a mail service delivering messages, newspapers, mail, using relays of horse-mounted riders that operated from April 3rd, 1860 to October 24th, 1861, between Missouri and California in the United States. The Pony Express was one way that communication could come across the land quickly. Most Pony Express riders were teens or around 18 years of age. They made a lot of money since the job was dangerous. A rider rode more than 1,800 miles in 10 days from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. There were 190 stations along the route, each 5 to 20 miles apart from each other. The arrival of American settlers in California continued after the gold rush. The Paiute tribe attempted to interfere with the migration. If you remember, the Paiute were the tribe that was along the border with Nevada in the desert. The Paiute Indian War began in 1861 along the Nevada border with California. And at this point, the Paiute had not been impacted by the gold rush, nor had they been impacted by the mission system. So at this point, the Paiute had still been able to maintain their traditional way of life until more and more settlers began to cross through their territory. During this Paiute Indian War, a telegraph is sent to California, and about 500 military men arrived to the territory of the Paiute, Washoe, and Paiute tribes. 2 battles were fought, and many died on both sides. The Paiute withdrew, and the American forces considered this a victory. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln becomes the 16th President of the United States in 1860. He promised the Homestead Act. He also pledged to oppose the expansion of slavery. When he was elected, South Carolina seceded from the United States on December 20th, 1860. To secede means to separate. So South Carolina separated itself from the United States. After much back and forth, Kansas enters the United States as a free state, based on a popular vote. Congress moves fast to organize the remaining territories in the West that had not become states yet. They place temporary governments that are friendly to the Union and are free soilers. By February 1st, 1861, six more states secede: Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These states declare themselves the Confederate States of America. President Buchanan and President elect Lincoln rejected the new government because neither wanted a separation of this territory. They wanted to find solutions to keep it together. President Lincoln is inaugurated and sworn in as president on March 4th, 1861. On April 12th, 1861, at Fort Sumter, Confederate forces fired on Union troops and the war began. It lasted 4 years, and this is the Civil War. Meanwhile, the transcontinental telegraph is finished from Washington, D.C. to California. President Lincoln receives the first message. This would mark the end of the Pony Express, since communication could now come through this telegraph line. California gets news about the Civil War and supports the Union. Of California's 150,000 settlers, 50,000 were born in the North and 30,000 were born in the South. Within California, there were conflicts about two sides of the Civil War. One idea was to separate, to secede as well, and become the Pacific Republic. So California considered separating itself and becoming its own country. Ultimately, California supplied thousands of soldiers to the Union and pushed back Confederate troops from Arizona and New Mexico. Also, many regiments went to fight for the Union to the East Coast. So ultimately, California did not secede from the United States. Meanwhile, Congress passes the Homestead Act, and President Lincoln signed it into law on May 20th, 1862. This law allowed citizens to settle on up to 160 acres of surveyed, meaning mapped land, but unclaimed public land. They would receive title to it after making improvements and residing there for 5 years. Because of the way the act was written, women and former slaves could petition for land too. These homesteaders would be free soilers. Another important development during this period is the Pacific Railroad. Congress passes the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 and 1864, which authorizes the Central Pacific and Union Pacific companies to build a transcontinental rail line along the 42nd parallel on the map. And you see there the red line and the blue lines on the map. The Act provides public lands and subsidies for every mile of track laid. So the Central Pacific and Union Pacific companies get free land to build this railroad, and they also get some money for the building of the railroad. So this was a big opportunity for these companies. At the same time, it was a huge endeavor, and it was not easy. Before the railroad was built, the land was surveyed to find the best possible route. Many maps were made of the Western Territory. So the decision was made to build the railroad along the center where there would be fewer mountain ranges, less snow in the winter, less flooding. So this was the best location for the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad made the trip to the West much faster. The trip was cut down from months to days. Telegraph line was built along the railroad to allow for trains to communicate, since the standard time was not yet established, and that would be established, I believe it was in the 1870s or 80s, when the standard time was established, meaning 5 o'clock was the same everywhere across the United States. Workers laid 1 mile of track per day. Workers were paid differently based on race. Chinese workers mostly lived in underground tunnels during the construction, while other workers lived in tents. The central line cut right through the plains of the roaming buffalo. Buffalo was hunted to feed the railway workers, and later fur trappers began to hunt them for their fur and hides. When the railroad between Sacramento and Omaha was completed on May 10, 1869, the buffalo began to see their demise. The railroad interrupted their migration pattern, and hunting expeditions from the railroad began. So the buffalo were a very sturdy animal, and they reproduced very easily, and they were very strong, and there were hundreds of thousands of buffalo during this time. After the railroad cut through their territory, their migration route, it disrupted their way of life, especially because this territory has flooding, winds, snow. But in addition, there were some hunting parties uh, that were offered as tourism for people to come through on the railroad and hunt the buffalo. So thousands of buffalo were killed that way. And here you see bones of many buffalo that had been killed along the railroad route. In addition, it was known that if the buffalo died, the Native Americans who counted on the buffalo for food would also die. The Plains tribes. These included the Blackfoot, Arapaho, Assiniboine, part related to the Sioux, the Cheyenne, Comanche, Crow, Gros Ventre, Kiowa, Lakota, Lipan, Plains Apache or Kiowa Apache, Plains Cree, Plains Ojibwe, Sarsi, Nakota, and Tonkawa. The Plains tribes had resisted the arrival of Westerners on their land and had fought for many years. Those were known as the Indian Wars in the 1800s. When the buffalo died, they almost starved. The U.S. military was able to defeat them and move them to live on reservations. Many officers of the Union Army had been stationed in California before the war. Also, many Californians who had migrated from the East Coast wanted to fight on the Eastern Front of the Civil War. A group of 100 men from California went to Massachusetts to fight. They paid for their own uniforms and weapons. They were called the California 100. 3 more companies of men or groups of men joined the California 100, and then they became known as the California Brigade. The California Battalion was instrumental in an important fight in the Civil War. It's known as Pickett's Charge at the Angle in Gettysburg. The California Battalion was able to hold the line of the Confederate soldiers. This battle could have been won by the South, but it was not. This was a turning point in the Civil War. While no battles were fought on California soil, many Californians fought in the Civil War.